The penthouse suite overlooked the neon-drenched urban skyline, but Sung-jin wasn't looking at the view. His eyes were fixed on the woman sleeping peacefully in his arms, her brown skin glowing against the white silk sheets. He traced his fingers gently along her collarbone, his thumb lingering on the small, jagged scar she had earned protecting him decades ago. Catherine stirred, her dark lashes fluttering open to reveal deep brown eyes that made Sung-jin's heart stop every single time. "You're staring again," she whispered, a small smile playing on her full lips. "I can't help it," Sung-jin replied, his voice a low, husky growl. "Do you know how long I've waited for this moment? To finally have you here with me, where you belong." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the sharp, dangerous line of his tattooed jaw. "Sung-jin." He caught her hand and pressed his lips to her palm. "I would burn this entire city to the ground for you, Catherine. I would destroy anyone who ever made you feel like you were less than the queen you are." Catherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You already did." Sung-jin pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, protective weight. "And I would do it again 1,000 times over. But before we continue with this beautiful moment, welcome to the family. Your support means everything to us, and I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. If you're ready to see how a woman forced to her knees claimed a global empire, kindly click that subscribe button. Now, let me take you back to where this incredible love story began. 3 months earlier. The sky was a bruised purple, and the rain was relentless. Catherine stood on the wet pavement, the cold water soaking through her thin clothes. Her knees burned against the concrete, but the sting of the rain was nothing compared to the humiliation radiating from the man standing over her. "Look at you," Derek sneered, his voice cutting through the sound of the storm like a knife. He held a water bottle mid-pour over her head, his expression one of pure contempt. "Standing there looking pathetic. You're lucky I even keep a nobody like you around." Catherine closed her eyes tightly, her hands resting on her thighs, holding herself upright with a silent, inner resilience even as the water streamed down her face. She had no idea that at that very moment, a black luxury vehicle was slowing to a crawl behind them, and the man inside was about to change her life forever. The sky over the city was the color of a fresh bruise, heavy and suffocating. Rain didn't just fall, it horizontalized, whipped by a biting wind that turned the evening air into a blade. Catherine Reynolds stood on the edge of the curb, her simple long-sleeve top plastered to her skin, her natural curls heavy and dripping. She wasn't just cold, she was hollow. "Please, Derek," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the downpour. "I just finished a 12-hour shift. I don't have the energy for this." Derek didn't care about her energy. He stood before her, looking immaculate in a fitted business suit that Catherine had paid for with 3 months of overtime pay. He looked like a success, a man of status, while she looked like the help. He leaned forward aggressively, his well-groomed beard glistening with droplets, his eyes narrowed with a cold, invasive contempt. "Down," he commanded. Catherine froze. The street was busy, headlights from passing cars caught the rain in golden flashes, illuminating the theater of her shame. "Derek, not here." "I said down," he roared, his voice echoing off the glass of the modern high-rises. "Since you want to act like a common servant who can't even remember to pick up my dry cleaning, you can start by showing some humility." Her knees hit the wet pavement with a sickening splash. The grit of the concrete bit into her skin, but she didn't collapse. She held her torso upright, her hands resting on her thighs, her eyes closed tightly as she tried to retreat to a place inside herself where his words couldn't reach. Derek pulled a plastic water bottle from his pocket. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unscrewed the cap and began to pour it over her head. The tepid water mixed with the freezing rain, streaming down her furrowed brow and into her collar. "Look at you," he sneered, leaning in so close she could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath. "The kneeling woman. My coworkers saw you at the bus stop yesterday, Catherine. They asked me if I'd hired a new maid. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to be tied to someone so pathetic? You're a nobody. A ghost in a green shirt." Catherine didn't answer. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, her inner resilience a small, flickering flame in a hurricane. She was so focused on surviving the moment that she didn't notice the change in the atmosphere. She didn't see the heavy, black luxury vehicle that had drifted to a silent halt just yards away. She didn't see the three men in dark suits stepping out in perfect formation. And she certainly didn't see the tall, lean figure in a long black tailored coat who was now walking toward them with deliberate, controlled steps. A man whose restrained fury was about to turn Derek's world into ash. The cold from the pavement seemed to seep into Catherine's very bones, a permanent companion that followed her long after she managed to stand up and retreat into the shadows of the night. Her life was a relentless cycle of exhaustion, a mechanical existence where the sun never truly rose. Every morning began at 4 a.m. in the dim, flickering light of their cramped apartment, where the air always smelled of Derek's expensive cologne and stale cigarettes. While he slept soundly beneath the plush duvet she had labored to buy, Catherine was already on her feet, nursing her cracked, red hands and preparing the elaborate breakfast he demanded but rarely thanked her for. Her days were a blur of steam and grease. At the restaurant, the roar of the industrial dishwasher was the only music she knew. She worked double shifts, moving with a weary grace among the clattering porcelain and silver, her back aching with a dull, constant throb. The manager took advantage of her silence, piling on extra tasks that weren't hers to do, knowing she couldn't, protest. Every one she earned was meticulously tucked away, not for herself, but to fuel the lifestyle Derek claimed he needed to network for a better future. When she finally returned home, the psychological cage tightened. Derek didn't just want her labor, he wanted her spirit. He had a way of looking at her, a slow, sweeping gaze of disappointment, that made her feel smaller than the dust on the floorboards. He would leave her magazines open to pictures of polished, high-society women, pointedly sighing as he looked from the glossy pages to her tired face and work-worn clothes. "Presentation is everything, Catherine," he would say, his voice smooth and poisonous. "How am I supposed to climb the ladder when my anchor is dragging in the mud?" He isolated her with a surgeon's precision, mocking the common way she spoke and reminding her daily that without his name and his roof, she was just another nameless face in a city that didn't see her. He made her believe that her poverty was a character flaw, and that her devotion was merely the minimum payment for his continued presence. She survived on the scraps of his affection, tiny crumbs of kindness he threw her way only when he needed something, leaving her starved for a dignity she could barely remember. Yet, even as she scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees that evening, the memory of the black car from the street haunted her. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of her routine felt like a shell that was beginning to crack. She didn't know it yet, but the $40 billion ghost of her mother was stirring, and the man with the tattooed jaw was already dismantling the walls of her prison. The following evening, the rain had tapered off into a thick, clinging mist that blurred the city's neon lights into ghostly smudges of pink and blue. Catherine stepped out of the restaurant's service entrance, her muscles screaming after a 14-hour shift. The heavy scent of industrial soap and old grease clung to her clothes, a scent she feared she would never truly wash away. She pulled her thin cardigan tight around her chest, keeping her head down as she began the long walk toward the subway station. The streets were quieter than usual, the damp pavement reflecting the overhead streetlights like a dark, polished mirror. Usually, Catherine felt invisible, a shadow among shadows, but tonight, a prickle of unease danced along the nape of her neck. It was the feeling of eyes upon her, a heavy, focused gaze that didn't belong to the casual city dweller. As she turned onto a narrower side street, she heard it, the low, rhythmic hum of a powerful engine. It wasn't the erratic sputter of the local taxis or the roar of a delivery truck. It was a deep, predatory purr. She slowed her pace, her heart beginning to drum against her ribs. In the reflection of a darkened storefront window, she saw it. A massive, obsidian black luxury SUV was crawling along the curb behind her. Its windows were tinted so deeply they looked like sheets of solid midnight, and its headlights were dimmed to a soft, golden glow that cut through the fog. It moved with a terrifying patience, keeping a precise 10-foot distance, never gaining, never falling behind. Catherine's breath hitched. "Is it Derek?" she wondered, her stomach clenching. But Derek didn't have access to a car like this, and he certainly didn't have the discipline to be this quiet. She quickened her step, her worn sneakers splashing through shallow puddles. The car mirrored her perfectly. When she crossed the street, the vehicle glided across the lane without a signal, a silent phantom in the mist. Panic began to rise in her throat, a cold, sharp thing. She considered running, but her legs felt like lead, and where would she go? The world she lived in offered no sanctuary. Just as she reached the mouth of the subway entrance, the vehicle accelerated slightly, pulling up alongside her. The passenger window slid down with a faint, electronic hiss. Catherine braced herself, expecting a threat or a taunt, her hands trembling as she clutched her bag. Instead, she saw the silhouette of a man in the back seat. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But the sheer gravity of his presence seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. In the dim light of the dashboard, she caught the faint glint of dark ink stretching up a powerful neck and the sharp, regal line of a jaw that looked carved from stone. For a fleeting second, his eyes met hers through the gloom, intense, searching, and filled with a recognition that Catherine couldn't yet understand. Then, as quickly as it had approached, the window glided shut, and the black shadow disappeared into the fog, leaving Catherine standing alone on the stairs, her heart racing and the ghost of a memory tugging at the corners of her mind. The following morning, the black car didn't just follow, it waited. Catherine found it idling outside the service entrance of the restaurant, its presence a stark, obsidian contrast to the grime of the alleyway. As she stepped into the cool air, her heart hammered against her ribs, but today, she didn't run. Something about the way the vehicle sat there, silent, watchful, and strangely respectful, held her in place. The rear door glided open with a soft click. A man stepped out, and the world seemed to narrow until he was the only thing in focus. He was tall, his sharp facial structure illuminated by the morning light, and his dark hair was slicked back with military precision. Under the open collar of his tailored black coat, the dark ink of a tattoo peeked out, suggesting a life of violence refined into power. He moved with a deliberate, controlled grace that made the air feel heavy. Catherine clutched her worn bag to her chest. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling but her gaze steady. "Why are you following me?" The man stopped a few feet away. His expression, which had been a mask of restrained intensity, softened into something achingly familiar. He looked at her not as Derek did, with a tally of her flaws, but as if he were seeing a miracle he had spent a lifetime searching for. "You don't remember, do you?" His voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a jolt of recognition through her. "The playground in Chicago. St. Jude's. The winter the older boys decided that the boy who couldn't speak English was an easy target." Catherine felt the breath leave her lungs. A memory, long buried under the weight of her current misery, surged to the surface. She saw a skinny, terrified boy cornered against a chain-link fence, and a younger version of herself standing between him and the bullies, holding a heavy stick and refusing to move. "Song Jean," she whispered, the name tasting like a half-forgotten prayer. "You called me Jean," he corrected gently, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "You took a blow to the shoulder that was meant for me. You told me that as long as you were there, I would never be alone." He took a single step closer, his eyes burning with an ancient loyalty. "I spent 20 years becoming the man who could find you. I spent 20 years making sure that no one would ever hurt you again." Catherine looked at his sharp jaw, the expensive coat, and the 3 bodyguards standing like statues behind him. This wasn't just a childhood friend, this was a king. "I'm a dishwasher, Song Jean," she said, her voice breaking as she looked down at her stained clothes. "I'm nothing." "To the world perhaps," Song Jean said, his voice turning hard as steel. "But you are the woman who saved my life. And you are the heir to a legacy that makes this city look like a playground. I am here to collect my debt, Catherine. And I am here to give you back your throne." The following afternoon, Derek arrived home in a foul mood, his ego bruised by a minor setback at the firm. He expected to find Catherine in her usual position, hunched over the stove or scrubbing the baseboards, but the apartment was silent. When he finally found her, she was standing by the window, her eyes fixed on the street below with a distant, haunted look he didn't recognize. "What is this?" Derek snapped, tossing his briefcase onto the table. "Where is my dinner? And why are you standing there like you've actually got something to think about?" Before Catherine could answer, a heavy, rhythmic knock sounded at the door. It wasn't the tentative tap of a neighbor, it was a demand. Derek scowled, adjusting his tie as he marched to the door. "If this is another bill collector, Catherine, I swear." He threw the door open, ready to unleash his rehearsed corporate arrogance. Instead, he hit a wall of pure, concentrated power. Song-jin stood in the hallway, flanked by two bodyguards whose presence turned the narrow corridor into a fortress. The Mafia boss was draped in a charcoal overcoat that cost more than Derek's yearly salary, his eyes like two chips of flint. Derek recoiled for a split second before his insecurity masked itself as bravado. He puffed out his chest, looking Song-jin up and down. "Can I help you? This is a private residence. If you're looking for the super, he's in the basement." Song-jin didn't move. He didn't even blink. He simply looked past Derek toward Catherine. "Are you ready?" "Wait a minute." Derek stepped into Song-jin's personal space, pointing a finger. "I don't know who you think you are, coming here looking like a movie extra, but this is my wife. You don't speak to her. You speak to me." Song-jin finally shifted his gaze to Derek. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. With a movement so fast the eye could barely track it, Song-jin's hand shot out, catching Derek's pointing finger and bending it back just far enough to cause a sharp yelp of pain. "You are leaning on a pillar of glass, little man," Song-jin said, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. "I have killed men for looking at her with a fraction of the disrespect you show daily. Do not mistake my restraint for mercy." Derek's face went pale, his businessman persona evaporating instantly. He tried to pull away, but Song-jin's grip was an iron vice. The Mafia boss leaned in, his tattooed neck tensing. "You've spent years making her feel small so you could feel big. Those days ended the moment I found her." He released Derek with a dismissive flick, as if he were discarding a piece of trash. Derek stumbled back, clutching his hand, his eyes wide with a terror he couldn't hide. Song-jin didn't spare him another glance. He held out a hand to Catherine. "Let's go, Catherine. You have a legacy to claim, and I have a city to show you." The transition was so seamless it felt like a fever dream. One moment, Catherine was standing in the dim, peeling hallway of a walk-up apartment that smelled of failure. The next, she was being ushered into a world where the very air seemed to hum with wealth and precision. The black SUV glided through the city like a silent predator, eventually pulling into the private subterranean garage of a shimmering glass monolith that pierced the clouds of Gangnam. As the elevator ascended in a blur of brushed steel and silent speed, Catherine caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. She saw a woman in a faded green top and worn-out shoes, her hair still holding the ghost of the previous night's rain. Beside her, Song-jin stood like a monument of dark elegance, his presence filling the small space with an overwhelming sense of security. The doors opened, and Catherine stepped out into what looked like a sanctuary carved from light and stone. This was the heart of the Song-jin's empire, the sanctuary of glass. The floors were polished obsidian, reflecting the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the world below. It was a dizzying perspective. From here, the people on the streets were nothing more than microscopic specks, and the problems that had nearly crushed her soul seemed suddenly impossibly small. Men and women in sharp, dark suits bowed in perfect unison as Song-jin walked past, their voices a synchronized chorus of respect. They didn't look at Catherine with the pity she was used to, nor the contempt Derek favored. They looked at her with a terrifying level of deference, as if she were a queen returning from a long exile. Song-jin led her to a private terrace where the wind was blocked by invisible glass barriers. He turned to her, the orange glow of the setting sun catching the sharp planes of his face. "This is how the world looks when you are no longer beneath its heel, Catherine," he said softly. He gestured to the sprawling luxury around them, the minimalist art, the state-of-the-art technology, and the sheer, unadulterated power that radiated from every corner of the headquarters. "This is the world your mother built a foundation for. This is the world I have maintained in your absence. Everything you see, everything I control. It has all been a placeholder for you." Catherine walked to the edge of the glass, her fingers trembling as she touched the cool surface. For years, she had lived in a world of shadows and scraps. Now, looking out at the glittering horizon, the realization began to sink in. She wasn't just a survivor of a broken marriage or a girl from an orphanage. She was a woman of consequence, standing in a sanctuary built of glass and steel, finally seeing the heights she was always meant to inhabit. The silence of the sanctuary was heavy, broken only by the soft hum of the climate control. Song-jin led Catherine to a massive desk of polished mahogany, where a single, sleek tablet lay waiting. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood behind her, his presence a warm, solid weight that anchored her as the digital screen flickered to life. 4 years, you were told that your mother was a runaway, a woman who left you with nothing but a name, Song-jin began, his voice dropping to a somber, respectful tone. The truth is, she was the architect of a global shipping and tech empire that spanned 3 continents. She didn't leave you because she wanted to, Catherine. She was forced into hiding to protect you from the very people who eventually took her life. He swiped his hand across the screen, and a series of complex financial documents appeared. Catherine's eyes scanned the numbers, but her brain refused to process the sheer scale of them. Row after row of figures, offshore accounts, and diversified portfolios blurred before her. "What am I looking at?" she whispered, her heart beginning to thud painfully against her ribs. Song-jin leaned down, his face close to hers. "This is the Reynolds Okono Trust. It has been accruing interest and expanding under my organization's protection for 2 decades. It was designed to unlock only when I found the rightful heir, the girl with the scar and the heart of a lion." He tapped a final icon. The screen shifted to a single, staggering number, $40 billion. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. She thought of the raw, chapped skin on her hands from scrubbing dishes for pennies. She thought of Derek mocking her for wanting a new pair of shoes, and the 3 months of tips she had saved just to buy him a suit he didn't deserve. The irony was a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. $40 billion, she breathed, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. It's impossible." "It is your birthright," Song-jin insisted, his hand moving to rest firmly on her shoulder. "You are not a dishwasher, Catherine. You are the sole proprietor of a fortune that can buy and sell the very firms Derek dreams of working for. You are the most powerful woman in this city, and as of this moment, the world is officially in your debt." Catherine stared at the glowing zeros. The worthless woman Derek had spat on in the rain was gone. In her place sat an empress with the resources to reshape reality. She looked up at Song-jin, her eyes gleaming with a new, dangerous clarity. The fear was receding, replaced by a cold, burning sense of justice. "My uncle," she said, her voice steadying. "He killed her for this, didn't he?" Song-jin nodded, his expression turning lethal. "He did. And he thinks you are a ghost. He has no idea that the ghost has just inherited the world." The golden light of the penthouse felt suddenly cold, as if the massive numbers on the screen had brought with them the chill of the grave. Song-jin moved to a lacquer cabinet, retrieving a thin, weathered file. He handled it with a reverence that told Catherine the contents were written in blood. "Your mother, Elena Reynolds, didn't just build an empire, she built a target," Song-jin said, his voice tightening with a dark, controlled edge. "She was brilliant, a visionary who saw the future of global trade. But her success was a thorn in the side of her own brother, Chukwuemeka. He saw her not as a sister, but as an obstacle to the throne of the family's estate." He opened the file, revealing grainy photographs and translated police reports from decades ago. Catherine's breath hitched as she saw a photo of her mother, a woman with the same defiant spark in her eyes that Catherine had fought so hard to keep alive in herself. The accident in London, the brake failure on the rainy night she was supposedly driving alone. "It wasn't an accident," Song-jin continued, his eyes locked on Catherine's. "Chukwuemeka paid the mechanics. He orchestrated the chaos, and then he spent the next 20 years searching for you, the final loose end. He told the world she died penniless and that her child was lost to the system. He took the titles, the mansions, and the immediate assets, but he could never find the key to the $40 billion trust. Because your mother had already hidden it where he would never look, in the hands of a young boy she had once helped in the States, a boy who grew up to ensure that her brother would never touch a single cent of it." Catherine traced the edge of her mother's photo. The betrayal was a physical ache, a jagged blade twisting in her chest. All those years she had spent wondering why she was alone, why she was discarded, were lies fed to her by a world that wanted her to stay small. Her poverty hadn't been an act of fate, it was a crime. "He's in Seoul, isn't he?" Catherine asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "He arrived 3 days ago," Song-jin replied, stepping closer until he was a protective shadow over her. He thinks he's here to finalize the legal absorption of the remaining trust. He believes you are a ghost, a girl who probably died in a gutter years ago. He has no idea that the girl is standing in the strongest fortress in Korea, and that she has the most lethal organization in the East at her back. Catherine closed the file, the sound echoing like a gavel. The grief was there, but it was being rapidly overtaken by a cold, calculating fury. She looked at her hands, the hands of a dishwasher, now the hands of an heiress. He took her life because he thought no one would care. He's about to find out how wrong he was. The silence in the sanctuary of glass was absolute, but in Catherine's mind, the noise was deafening. She looked away from the financial documents and toward the reflection in the window, her hand instinctively rising to the base of her throat. There, just beneath the collar of her worn shirt, sat a jagged crescent-shaped scar, the scarlet mark she had carried since she was 8 years old. For years, she had told herself it was just a remnant of a chaotic childhood, a nameless injury from a nameless time. But under Song Jin's steady, knowing gaze, the fog finally cleared. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was back in the Chicago winter, the sky the color of dirty slush. She saw a younger Song Jin, a boy who was small for his age and spoke a language the other foster kids mocked. He was cornered in the frozen alleyway behind the orphanage by 3 older boys who had cornered him to steal the small, carved wooden bird his mother had given him before she died. Catherine hadn't hesitated. She had stepped into the circle of bullies, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. When the leader had swung a jagged piece of a broken crate toward Song Jin's face, Catherine had lunged forward. She didn't feel the pain at first, only the searing heat as the wood tore into her skin. She remembered the sight of her own blood staining the white snow, and the way the bullies had scrambled away in terror at the sight of her defiance. She remembered Song Jin's small, trembling hands pressing a tattered scarf against her neck to stop the bleeding. He had looked at her with an intensity that transcended their age, his dark eyes brimming with a silent, sacred vow. "I will never forget," he had whispered in broken English. "One day, I will be the shield for you." "You kept it," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling as she looked back at the man standing before her. "The promise. You really kept it." Song Jin stepped into her personal space, his fingers ghosting over the air just inches from the scar. He didn't touch her, but the heat from his hand was a comfort she hadn't felt in a lifetime. "I spent every day of the last 20 years becoming the man who deserved the blood you spilled for me," he said, his voice thick with a rare, raw emotion. "That mark isn't a sign of your poverty, Catherine. It is the seal of your nobility. It is the reason I am standing here today." For the first time since Derek had forced her to her knees in the rain, Catherine didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a warrior. The scar wasn't a blemish, it was a medal. She looked at Song Jin, and the bond between them, forged in blood and frozen Chicago mud, snapped into place, stronger than any empire. Catherine climbed the stairs to the apartment for what she knew would be the last time. The air in the stairwell was stale, heavy with the scent of neglect, a scent that had defined her existence for far too long. She didn't feel the usual knot of anxiety in her stomach. Instead, there was a cold, crystalline stillness. She was no longer the woman who knelt in the rain. She was a ghost returning to collect her things before moving on to the afterlife of her own design. When she entered, the living room was dark, save for the blue flicker of the television. Derek was slumped on the sofa, an empty glass in his hand. He didn't look up as she walked past him toward the bedroom. "Where have you been?" he slurred, his voice thick with the arrogance of a man who still believed he held the leash. "You left me here with that freak at the door. Do you have any idea how much you've embarrassed me?" Catherine didn't answer. She pulled an old suitcase from under the bed and began to methodically fold the few items she actually owned. The silence seemed to agitate him more than a scream would have. He appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, his face flushed with a mixture of alcohol and wounded pride. "I'm talking to you, Catherine. Stop touching that bag." He lunged forward, grabbing her wrist and twisting it. "You think because some guy in a suit shows up that you can just leave? You're nothing without me. You're a dishwasher. You're a charity case I took in because I felt sorry for you." Catherine looked at his hand on her wrist, then up at his eyes. She didn't flinch. "I'm not a dishwasher, Derek," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "And you never felt sorry for me. You just needed someone you could feel superior to." His eyes widened, his grip tightening until her skin paled. "You've got a lot of nerve," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You're staying right here. You're going to cook my dinner, and then you're going to apologize on your knees." When she tried to pull away, his rage finally snapped. He raised his hand, his features contorted into a mask of domestic tyranny. "I'll give you a reason to cry." The blow never landed. Before he could swing, the front door of the apartment didn't just open, it exploded inward. The frame splintered with a deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot. Derek spun around, his mouth hanging open, as three shadows flooded the room with the precision of a strike team. Sung-jin stepped through the wreckage of the doorway, his eyes fixed on Derek's hand still clutching Catherine's wrist. He didn't say a word, but the aura of restrained violence he brought with him turned the small bedroom into a pressurized chamber. Derek's bravado vanished instantly, his knees beginning to shake as he realized that the man from the hallway hadn't been a warning. He was a reckoning. The air in the bedroom didn't just grow cold, it became electric with a lethal, focused intent. Derek's hand, which had been clamped like a vice around Catherine's wrist, began to tremble. He looked from the splintered doorway to the man standing there, and the realization hit him that his world of petty dominance was over. Sung-jin didn't rush. He walked into the room with the measured gait of a king surveying a ruin. Behind him, his bodyguards stood like statues of obsidian, their faces devoid of emotion, their eyes fixed on Derek with the clinical detachment of a butcher looking at a side of beef. "I believe I told you," Sung-jin said, his voice a low, melodic threat that vibrated in the small space, "not to mistake my restraint for mercy." Derek scrambled backward, tripping over the very suitcase Catherine had been trying to pack. This is breaking and entering. I'll call the police. You can't just." Sung-jin was in front of him before the sentence could finish. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He simply reached out and gripped the front of Derek's expensive, silk-blend shirt, the one Catherine had scrubbed floors to pay for, and hoisted him upward until his toes barely grazed the carpet. "You will call no one," Sung-jin whispered. "Because as of this minute, you no longer exist in this city. You have spent years convincing this woman she was nothing, while you lived off the marrow of her bones. You have laid hands on a queen." Sung-jin's gaze shifted to Catherine. For a fleeting second, the terrifying predator vanished, replaced by the boy who had once hidden behind her in the Chicago snow. "Catherine, do you want him to stay?" Catherine looked at Derek. She saw the man who had poured water over her head in the rain, the man who had mocked her mother's memory, and the man who had tried to strike her moments ago. The fear she had carried for years didn't just evaporate, it turned into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. "No," she said, her voice clear and unbroken. "I never want to see him again." Sung-jin nodded once. He turned back to Derek, his expression settling into something final. "You heard her." He tossed Derek toward his guards as if he were a bag of refuse. "Take him. Ensure he understands that if he ever breathes the same air as her again, the consequences will be permanent." As the guards dragged a sobbing, pleading Derek out of the apartment, the suffocating weight of the last few years lifted from the room. Sung-jin turned back to Catherine. He didn't move toward her, giving her the space to breathe in her new reality. "He is gone, Catherine," Sung-jin said softly. "The prison is empty. Are you ready to go home?" Catherine looked at the suitcase, then at the man who had traveled across the world to save her. She left the bag where it lay. She didn't need anything from this life anymore. She walked toward Sung-jin, her head held high, and stepped through the broken door into the light. The transition from the cramped, hostile walls of the apartment to the sprawling silence of Sung-jin's penthouse was like emerging from a long, suffocating tunnel into the first light of dawn. The air here was different, crisp, scented with expensive wood smoke and white tea, and for the first days, Catherine found herself walking on tiptoe, as if the luxury were a fragile dream that might shatter if she pressed too hard. Sung-jin did not rush her. He moved through the space like a quiet, protective shadow, ensuring that her every need was met before she even had to voice it. He replaced her worn, stained clothes with fabrics that felt like liquid against her skin. Cashmere, silk, and and wool in soft tones of cream and gold. When she first saw herself in the full-length mirror of the master suite, she barely recognized the woman looking back. The hollow look in her eyes was beginning to soften, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning strength. "You don't have to keep your head down here, Catherine," Songjin said one evening. They were sitting by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the first true snow of winter begin to drift over the city. He was seated in a leather armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, but his gaze, as always, was anchored on her. "In this house, you are the highest authority. My men, my resources, and my life are at your disposal." Catherine leaned back against the velvet sofa, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa. It was a simple thing, but the warmth of it felt like a miracle. For years, her hands had only known the sting of lye and the bite of cold water. Now they were soft, pampered by oils and rest. "It's so quiet," she whispered. "I keep waiting for the door to slam. I keep waiting for someone to tell me I'm doing it all wrong." Songjin set his glass down and moved to the floor beside her, resting his arm on the cushion near her knee. He looked at her with an intensity that made the rest of the world fall away. "No one will ever raise a voice to you again. You are safe. And more than that, you are wanted." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. It wasn't the invasive, controlling touch she had grown accustomed to, it was a gesture of worship. In the silence of the penthouse, Catherine felt the last of Derek's poison leaving her system. She wasn't a maid, a burden, or a ghost. She was the girl who had stood her ground in the Chicago snow, and she was the woman who was finally learning how to be loved. As the snow blanketed the city below, a profound sense of peace settled over her, a winter's peace that signaled the end of her survival and the beginning of her reign. The peace of the winter morning was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in their sanctuary, the sharp, rhythmic thud of a heavy object hitting the polished mahogany of the main hall's entrance. Songjin was on his feet before the sound had fully faded, his hand instinctively reaching for the firearm concealed beneath his tailored vest. He signaled for Catherine to stay back, his eyes narrowing into the cold, lethal slits of a man who lived and breathed war. In the center of the foyer lay a small, ornate box made of dark ebony, wrapped in a traditional Nigerian silk cloth. It was a beautiful object, but the air around it felt toxic. One of Songjin's men swept the area with a scanner, nodding once to indicate it was safe to open. Songjin flipped the lid back. Inside, resting on a bed of white velvet, was a single, ancient gold coin, the crest of the Akono royal lineage, and a photograph. Catherine stepped forward despite Songjin's silent protest, her breath hitching as she saw the image. It was a candid shot of her taken only an hour ago through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Across her chest, a laser-red crosshair had been meticulously drawn. Tucked into the side was a note written in a heavy, arrogant script. "The dead should stay buried, Catherine. Inheritance is for those with the strength to hold it. You have 48 hours to sign over the Akono interests and vanish, or the snow in Seoul will run red with more than just a memory." It was signed with a single, wax-sealed crest, Chikwamika. The silence that followed was suffocating. Catherine felt the phantom sting of the Chicago winter, the old fear trying to claw its way back into her throat. Her uncle wasn't just coming for the money, he was coming to finish what he had started on that rainy night in London. He was coming to erase the last piece of his sister's legacy. Songjin picked up the gold coin, his grip so tight his knuckles turned white. He didn't look at the threat, he looked at Catherine. The restrained fury he had shown toward Derek was nothing compared to the cold, absolute darkness now radiating from him. "He made a mistake," Songjin said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that promised a storm. "He thinks he's hunting a defenseless girl in a rundown apartment. He doesn't realize he's just declared war on the Kong organization." He turned to his lead strategist, his eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. "Mobilize every sector. I want the Akono mercenaries tracked from the moment they touched Korean soil. If a single one of them breathes in her direction, I want their entire lineage erased." Catherine reached out, her fingers brushing the gold coin. The fear was there, but beneath it, the $40 billion ghost of her mother was screaming for justice. She looked at Songjin, her eyes reflecting the same lethal resolve. "Don't just track them, Songjin. End this. I'm tired of running from ghosts. The confrontation didn't take place in a dark alley or a hidden warehouse, but in the sterile, high-stakes arena of a private boardroom at the Kong headquarters. Uncle Chukwuemeka sat at the head of the obsidian table, flanked by high-priced lawyers and a pair of mercenaries who looked like they were made of stone. He looked every bit the billionaire usurper, until the heavy double doors swung open and Catherine walked in. She didn't look like the broken girl he had hunted for 20 years. Dressed in a sharp, tailored suit of midnight blue, her hair styled in a regal crown of curls, she radiated a power that made the air in the room turn brittle. Song-jin walked half a step behind her, a silent, lethal shadow that made Chukwuemeka's mercenaries shift uncomfortably. "You've grown," Chukwuemeka said, his voice a smooth, oily baritone as he leaned back. "You have your mother's eyes. It's a pity they'll be closed so soon if you don't sign the papers in front of you." Catherine didn't sit. She stood at the foot of the table, looking down the length of it as if it were a battlefield she had already won. "The only things being closed today, Uncle, are your accounts." Chukwuemeka laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You think a few bodyguards in Seoul can stop the momentum of the Okono estate? I have the signatures. I have the board." "You have nothing," Song-jin spoke, his voice a low, vibrating chord of authority. He tossed a thin tablet onto the table. It slid perfectly to the center, lighting up with a live feed of global financial markets. "While you were busy sending trinkets to my penthouse, my organization was busy acquiring the debt of every subsidiary you own. We didn't just freeze your assets, Chukwuemeka. We bought them." Catherine watched the blood drain from her uncle's face as he scrolled through the data. He saw the systematic dismantling of his power in real time, contracts being voided, board members being arrested for the conspiracy in London, and the $40 billion trust being funneled into a new untouchable entity, the Elena Reynolds Foundation. "You killed my mother for a throne made of sand," Catherine said, her voice echoing with the weight of 20 years of silence. "You kept me in the dark, hoping I would die in the streets. But a queen doesn't forget. And she certainly doesn't forgive." Chukwuemeka lunged forward, his face contorting into a mask of desperation, but Song-jin was faster. He stepped between them, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade hidden beneath his coat. The mercenaries didn't move. They knew that to draw a weapon was to die. "The authorities are waiting downstairs," Catherine finished, her gaze cold and final. "You wanted the Okono legacy? Here it is. You will die in a cell, known only as the man who tried to steal from the woman who owned the world." As the security team moved in to escort the broken man out, Catherine finally let out a breath she had been holding since she was 8 years old. The empire was dismantled. The debt was paid. The transition from a life of shadows to one of blinding brilliance was finalized on a spring afternoon when the cherry blossoms in Seoul were at their peak, drifting like soft pink snow over the gardens of the Okonosong estate. Catherine stood before a triptych of floor-to-ceiling mirrors, draped in a gown of hand-woven Nigerian silk embroidered with thousands of microscopic South Korean pearls. It was a fusion of two worlds, much like the woman herself. The kneeling woman was gone, replaced by a figure of such poise and grace that the air seemed to still in her presence. Song-jin entered the room, his usual dark suits replaced by a ceremonial uniform that bore the crest of his lineage. When his eyes met hers, the iron-willed Mafia boss visibly softened, his breath hitching as it always did when he looked at her. He walked to her side, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw before resting on the scar at her neck, the mark that had started it all. "You are more than a queen today, Catherine," he whispered, his voice thick with a fierce, quiet pride. "You are the justice your mother dreamed of." The ceremony was a testament to their combined power, attended by global leaders and the silent, sharp-eyed men of Song-jin's organization alike. As they exchanged vows, Catherine didn't look at the cameras or the glittering crowd. She looked only at the man who had never stopped searching for the girl who had once stood in his way to protect him. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the cheers echoed far beyond the estate, signaling the dawn of a new era. But the coronation was not just about a crown or a name. Within months, the Elena Reynolds Foundation had become a global force. Catherine didn't sit in ivory towers. She returned to the streets, building state-of-the-art orphanages in Chicago, Seoul, and Lagos. She funded hospitals where the nobodies of the world could find care without shame. She used her $40 billion legacy to ensure that no child would ever have to stand alone in a frozen playground, and no woman would ever have to kneel in the rain for a man's approval.